Imagine opening your bank account and seeing $10,000 sitting there, untouched, fully yours, and noticing that instead of relief or a sense of progress, the dominant feeling is a quiet underwhelm. Almost as if the number fails to register as meaningful in the context of your life, even though not long ago it might have represented months or even years of effort. This reaction seems irrational at first, but it reveals something deeper about how humans interpret money, not as an absolute quantity, but as a relative signal shaped by thresholds, expectations, and the systems surrounding us. The idea that $10,000 feels small is not really about the number itself, but about where it sits in the broader financial structure you are navigating. Because money is rarely experienced in isolation, it is experienced against expenses, future obligations, and perceived milestones, and when those surrounding figures are significantly larger, the psychological weight of 10,000 begins to compress. A rent payment, a medical bill, a car repair, or a few months of living expenses can quickly consume that amount, and the brain, which constantly evaluates sufficiency rather than magnitude, starts categorizing it not as progress, but as temporary coverage. This is where the threshold effect begins to take shape, because human perception tends to organize financial progress into invisible tiers, and each tier represents a shift in what money can actually do for you, rather than how much it simply is. Below a certain threshold, money feels fragile and easily reversible, meaning it can disappear through a small number of events, and because of that fragility, the brain discounts its significance. $10,000 often sits in this unstable zone for many people, where it is undeniably useful, but not yet transformative, and that distinction matters more than the raw figure itself. To understand this more clearly, it helps to look at the basic math behind financial thresholds, because the impact of money is closely tied to how many months of stability it can purchase. If someone spends $2,000 per month, then $10,000 represents 5 months of coverage, which sounds substantial, but still leaves a clear expiration point, a visible edge where security ends. The presence of that edge keeps the mind anchored in caution, because the system has not yet transitioned from temporary safety to sustained resilience, and until that transition occurs, the number continues to feel smaller than it objectively is. As the amount grows, however, something subtle begins to shift, not in the arithmetic, but in the perception of permanence. When savings reach a level where they can absorb multiple categories of risk simultaneously, such as job loss, unexpected expenses, and time for recovery, the psychological framing changes from this can help to this can protect, and that shift marks the crossing of a threshold. The difference between 10,000 and, say, 30 or 50,000 is not just a multiple. It is a change in how many independent shocks the system can withstand before collapsing, and that resilience is what the brain is quietly measuring. This is why financial progress often feels non-linear, even when the math is perfectly linear, because the human mind does not reward incremental increases equally. It responds to crossings, to moments where a new layer of possibility or stability becomes available. Before a threshold is reached, additional money tends to feel like reinforcement of the same fragile state, but once the threshold is crossed, even a small increase beyond it can feel disproportionately significant, because it exists within a new category of security. There is also a behavioral layer to this effect, because when money sits below a meaningful threshold, people tend to treat it differently, often more cautiously but also sometimes more passively, as if the amount is too small to deploy strategically. This can lead to a kind of stagnation, where the money neither solves immediate problems nor meaningfully changes long-term positioning, reinforcing the perception that it is insignificant. In contrast, once a threshold is crossed, decision-making often becomes more deliberate, because the stakes feel higher and the potential impact of each choice becomes more visible. Historically, this pattern has appeared in many forms, especially during periods where the cost of living shifts faster than income growth, compressing the thresholds that define financial comfort. What once felt like a substantial buffer becomes a temporary cushion, and the psychological baseline adjusts accordingly, making previously meaningful amounts feel smaller over time. This is not simply inflation in the economic sense, but inflation in perceived sufficiency, where the thresholds themselves drift upward as systems become more expensive and complex. What makes this dynamic particularly important is that it can distort how progress is evaluated, because if someone measures their financial position purely by how it feels, rather than by what it objectively represents, they may underestimate the significance of early accumulation. $10,000, while it may feel small within a high-cost system, still represents a critical structural milestone because it marks the transition from zero resilience to some degree of optionality, even if that optionality is limited. The identity shift begins when you stop interpreting money solely through the lens of immediate sufficiency and start seeing it as part of a larger progression of thresholds, each with its own function and meaning. Instead of asking whether $10,000 feels like a lot, the more useful question becomes what threshold it is approaching, and what changes once that threshold is crossed. This reframing does not inflate the number or exaggerate its power, but it places it within a system where its role becomes clearer and more grounded. Over time, this perspective creates a more stable relationship with financial progress, because it replaces the vague and often discouraging feeling of this is not enough with a more structured understanding of where you are within a sequence of transitions. $10,000 may not yet represent full security or independence, but it is not meant to. It exists as an early layer in a system that builds in stages, and recognizing those stages allows the number to regain its context, even if it does not immediately change how it feels.